My grandkids came for summer. My 7-year-old granddaughter refused to eat. She whispered, "I hate it here. Mom said you are a poor loser." My heart broke. I hugged her and secretly called my driver. 3 hours, 4 Bentleys blocked my daughter-in-law's driveway. I stepped out and said 5 words that made her went pale. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I had been counting the days until summer for 3 months, 66 years old, and I still felt that childlike excitement when I knew my grandchildren were coming to stay. I spent weeks preparing my small apartment in Queens, buying their favorite cereals, setting up the pull-out couch in the living room with fresh sheets that smelled like fabric softener and hope. Fallon and James were supposed to arrive at 10 in the morning on that Tuesday in June. I had been up since 6, making pancakes from scratch the way I used to for their father when he was little. The kitchen felt warm and alive with the smell of vanilla and butter, and I caught myself humming while I cooked. These 2 weeks were going to be perfect. I was going to spoil them the way grandmothers are supposed to spoil their grandchildren. When Roman's car pulled up outside my building at exactly 10:15, I pressed my face against the window like an eager child. I watched him get out first, looking tired in that way that worried me. My son had always carried stress in his shoulders, and lately those shoulders seemed permanently hunched. Then Marlo emerged from the passenger seat, her designer sunglasses reflecting the morning sun, her movements sharp and impatient even from 3 floors up. But it was the children who made my heart skip. James, now 6, bounded out of the back seat with his usual energy, his Superman backpack nearly as big as he was. But Fallon moved differently. My 7-year-old granddaughter, usually the first to run toward any adventure, climbed out slowly, dragging a small pink suitcase behind her. Even from the window, I could see something was wrong. I buzzed them up and stood in my doorway, wiping my hands on my apron as I listened to their footsteps echoing in the stairwell. James appeared first, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "Grandma Celeste," he called, launching himself into my arms with the force of pure joy. I squeezed him tight, breathing in that sweet smell of childhood shampoo and morning sunshine. "There's my brave boy," I whispered into his hair. "I made pancakes." His face lit up like I had just promised him the moon. But when I looked over his head, Fallon was hanging back, half hidden behind her parents. Her usual bright smile was nowhere to be seen. Roman gave me a quick, distracted hug. "Thanks for this, Mom. We really need this time away." "Of course, sweetheart. That's what grandmothers are for." Marlo stepped forward, and I caught the familiar scent of her expensive perfume, something French and cold that always made me feel like I needed to apologize for existing in the same space as her. She didn't hug me. She never did. "Remember what we discussed about bedtimes?" she said, her voice carrying that tone she used when she wanted to make sure everyone knew she was the authority. 8:30 sharp, no exceptions, and limited screen time. Fallon has been having issues with authority lately, so you need to be firm with her. I nodded, though something about the way she said, "issues with authority," made my stomach tighten. "We'll be just fine, won't we, Princess?" I said, crouching down to Fallon's level. My granddaughter looked at me for a brief moment, and I saw something in her eyes that made my chest ache. It wasn't just sadness. It was something harder, something that seemed too old for a 7-year-old to carry. "I guess," she mumbled, not meeting my gaze. Marlo's smile was sharp as a blade. "They'll call you tonight to say goodnight, won't you, kids?" James nodded enthusiastically, but Fallon just shrugged. The gesture was so unlike her that I felt my first real stab of worry. After Roman and Marlo left, I tried to recapture the morning magic. I served the pancakes with strawberries cut into heart shapes, the way I used to do for Roman. James dove in with gusto, syrup dripping down his chin as he told me about his new bicycle and his friend Tommy who could do wheelies. But Fallon sat at my small kitchen table, staring at her plate like the pancakes were a personal insult. She had always been my little chatterbox, full of stories about school and friends and dreams about becoming a princess or a doctor or sometimes both. Now she sat in silence, pushing food around with her fork. "Not hungry, sweetheart?" I asked gently. She shook her head without looking up. "Maybe you're just tired from the car ride. We could watch a movie after breakfast. You can pick whichever one you want." Again, just a shake of her head. James, oblivious to the tension, finished his pancakes and asked if he could watch cartoons. I set him up in the living room with the remote, grateful that at least one of my grandchildren seemed happy to be here. When I returned to the kitchen, Fallon had pushed her plate away entirely. I sat down beside her, my heart hammering with a grandmother's instinct that something was terribly wrong. "Fallon, honey, what's going on? You seem so sad." For a moment I thought she might tell me. Her lower lip trembled, and she looked like she was fighting tears. Then she looked directly at me, and what she said next felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. "I hate it here," she whispered, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. "Mommy said you're a poor loser and we have to stay with you because Daddy feels sorry for you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my breath catch, felt the familiar sting of tears behind my eyes. But it was what came next that truly shattered me. "She said you never had anything good in your life, and that's why you live in this ugly place. She said real families don't live like this." I stared at my granddaughter, this beautiful little girl who had just repeated words that could only have come from her mother's mouth. Marlowe had poisoned her against me, filled her head with cruelty disguised as truth. "Oh, sweetheart," I managed to whisper, my voice breaking. Fallon's eyes filled with tears then, but not the kind of tears that come from sadness. These were angry tears, frustrated tears. "I don't want to be here. I want to go home. I want my mom." I reached out to touch her hand, but she pulled away. The rejection cut deeper than her words had. "Fallon, I know this place isn't fancy like your house, but Mommy said you're jealous of her because she's pretty and has nice things and you don't." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, like she had been holding them in for so long that they burst free. "She said you try to make Daddy feel guilty about you because you're old and alone and nobody else loves you." Each word was a knife twisting in my chest. I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. This wasn't just cruelty. This was systematic destruction of a relationship, and my 7-year-old granddaughter was the weapon. But what broke me completely was seeing the confusion in Fallon's eyes. She was repeating these horrible things, but part of her knew they were wrong. Part of her was fighting against the poison her mother had fed her, and the conflict was tearing her apart. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she whispered suddenly, and started to cry. Real tears now, the kind that come from a child's pure heart. "I don't want to say mean things to you, but Mommy said if I was nice to you, it would hurt her feelings. She said you're trying to steal me and James away from her." And there it was, the truth behind the cruelty. Marlowe hadn't just been content to exclude me from their lives. She had turned my own grandchildren into soldiers in a war I didn't even know we were fighting. I pulled Fallon into my arms then, despite her initial resistance. I held her while she sobbed against my shoulder, her small body shaking with the weight of emotions too big for her to understand. "It's okay, baby girl," I whispered into her hair. "None of this is your fault. You don't have to choose between loving your mommy and loving me. There's enough love in the world for everyone." But even as I comforted her, my mind was racing. This couldn't continue. I had spent 34 years since my husband's death protecting my family, sacrificing for them, putting their needs before my own. I had worked double shifts as a night nurse to put Roman through medical school. I had stayed quiet when Marlowe gradually pushed me out of family gatherings. I had accepted their neglect because I thought it was temporary, that eventually they would see how much I loved them. But this was different. This was using innocent children as weapons. This was emotional abuse, and I wasn't going to stand for it anymore. Still holding Fallon, I reached for my phone with my free hand. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. the number I had hoped I would never have to use. "Hello, Margaret?" I said quietly when my lawyer answered. "It's Celeste Montgomery. I think it's time we had that conversation about the trust." I hung up and held my granddaughter tighter. Marlo thought she was dealing with a poor, powerless old woman who would accept whatever scraps of affection she was thrown. She had no idea who she was really fighting, but she was about to find out. The phone call to Margaret had been brief, coded in the careful language we had developed over the years. "Prepare the Montgomery documents," was all I had to say. She understood immediately. After 28 years as my attorney, she knew exactly what that meant. I hung up and looked around my small apartment with new eyes. The faded wallpaper with tiny roses that I had never bothered to replace. The mismatched furniture I had collected from thrift stores and garage sales. The kitchen table that wobbled slightly because one leg was shorter than the others. For 34 years, this had been my choice. Not because I couldn't afford better, but because I wanted my son to learn that happiness didn't come from material things. Now, watching Fallon curl up on my old couch with James, both of them finally napping after our emotionally exhausting morning, I wondered if my sacrifice had been worth it. I had given up everything to teach Roman values that Marlo had systematically destroyed. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my armchair, the one Richard had loved to read in when we were young and stupidly in love. The memories came flooding back, as they always did when I let my guard down. Richard Montgomery had been everything my parents warned me against. Too old, they said. Too rich, they worried. Too different from our simple family that ran a small bakery in Brooklyn. But when he walked into our shop on that rainy afternoon in 1979, looking for a birthday cake for his secretary, I felt my world shift on its axis. He was 35 to my 21, sophisticated where I was naive, wealthy where I was working class. He should have been completely out of my league, but something about the way he smiled when I handed him the extra cupcake I had included for free made him seem approachable, human. "What's your name?" he had asked, and when I told him, he said it like it was something precious. We were married 18 months later, much to my parents' shocked delight and his family's horrified dismay. The Montgomery family had built their fortune through 3 generations of hospital ownership, starting with Richard's grandfather, who had immigrated from Ireland with nothing but determination and a basic understanding of medicine. By the time I married Richard, Montgomery Medical Group owned 7 hospitals across New York and New Jersey. I should have been intimidated by the wealth, by the sprawling estate in the Hamptons, by the expectation that I would seamlessly transform from a baker's daughter into a society wife. Instead, I was simply happy. Richard never made me feel like I wasn't enough. He encouraged me to finish nursing school, something my own family had seen as unnecessary once I was married. "Smart women make the best partners," he used to say. "I want you to have your own dreams, not just share mine." Roman was born in 1985, after 3 miscarriages that had left us both emotionally raw and desperately grateful for our miracle baby. Richard was a wonderful father, the kind of man who would leave important board meetings to attend a kindergarten play or help with homework. He used to tell Roman stories about the immigrant grandfather who built their family legacy through hard work and integrity. "Money is just a tool, son," he would say. "It's what you do with it that defines who you are." Our life was perfect in the way that should have warned me it was too good to last. Richard died on a Tuesday in March of 1990. A drunk driver ran a red light and turned our world into before and after. Roman was only 5 years old, still young enough to ask when Daddy was coming home, still innocent enough to believe that love could bring people back. The will reading was the first time I truly understood what Richard's love had protected me from. His family, who had barely tolerated me while he was alive, made their feelings crystal clear. His brother Charles, who was supposed to take over the medical group, stood in that mahogany-paneled law office and delivered what he clearly thought was a death sentence. Of course, Celeste will need to give up any claim to active participation in Montgomery Medical, he said, not even looking at me. A woman with her background couldn't possibly understand the complexities of running a medical empire. What Charles didn't know was that Richard had spent our 10 years of marriage teaching me exactly how to understand those complexities. I had sat in on board meetings, reviewed financial reports, learned the names and needs of every employee in our hospitals. Richard had been preparing me to be his partner in everything, not just his wife. But I was 28 years old, widowed with a 5-year-old child, and facing a family that saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their inheritance. The lawyer, old Mr. Fitzpatrick, read Richard's will with the solemnity it deserved. To my complete shock, Richard had left me everything, not just a widow's portion, but complete control of Montgomery Medical Group, the estate, all the investments, everything. Charles turned purple. Richard's mother actually gasped and had to be fanned with a magazine. But the will was ironclad, and Richard had been very specific about his reasoning. To my beloved wife Celeste, the document read in Richard's careful handwriting, who taught me that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give. She will know how to honor our family legacy while never forgetting where real value comes from. I could have taken control then. I could have stepped into the role of wealthy widow, raised Roman in the luxury his father had intended. But sitting in that law office, looking at the faces of people who saw me as an unworthy interloper, I made a decision that would shape the next 34 years of our lives. I signed the paperwork that put the medical group in trust, with professional managers handling day-to-day operations. I sold the estate and most of the obvious trappings of wealth. I took Roman back to Brooklyn, to a modest apartment 3 blocks from the bakery where his father had first found me, and I went to work as a night shift nurse. "Why are we living here, Mommy?" 5-year-old Roman had asked on our first night in our new home. "Why can't we live in our big house anymore?" "Because," I had told him, smoothing his hair as he lay in his new twin bed, "your daddy wanted you to understand that being a good person matters more than having fancy things. We're going to learn to be happy with what we need, not what we want." Roman had nodded with the solemn acceptance of a child who trusted his mother to make sense of a world that had suddenly lost its anchor. I worked night shifts at Brooklyn General so I could be home during the day while Roman was at school. I did homework with him at our wobbly kitchen table and took him to free events in the park on weekends. When he asked for expensive toys, I taught him to save his allowance and appreciate the value of earning what he wanted. When his classmates bragged about their family's vacations, I took him on adventures through New York's museums and libraries. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was teaching my son that money didn't buy happiness, the trust fund I had established was growing exponentially. The hospitals I owned but never claimed were expanding, acquiring new facilities, becoming one of the most successful medical groups on the East Coast. Every year, Margaret would present me with reports showing increasing profits, and every year, I would tell her to reinvest everything and keep growing the fund for Roman's future. "Mrs. Montgomery," she had said during one of our annual meetings when Roman was in high school, "you realize you could live like a queen on just the interest from these investments?" "I don't want to be a queen, Margaret," I had replied. "I want to be a mother." Roman graduated from high school with a full academic scholarship to Columbia, something that filled me with pride but also worry. I had raised him to value education and hard work, but sending him to an elite university meant exposing him to a world of privilege I had deliberately shielded him from. Still, he thrived. He studied hard, made good friends, and called me every Sunday to tell me about his classes and his dreams of becoming a doctor like his father had been. He never asked where the money for medical school was coming from when his scholarships ran out, and I never told him. I simply arranged for anonymous benefactors to handle his expenses, letting him believe he was earning his way through merit and luck. It was at Columbia where he met Marlo. I knew something was different the first time Roman brought her home during his 3rd year of medical school. She was beautiful, certainly, with that polished perfection that money could buy from childhood. But it wasn't her appearance that worried me. It was the way she looked around our modest apartment, the careful way she smiled when I served dinner on my mismatched plates. "So you're a nurse," she had said, making conversation over my homemade lasagna. "That must be fulfilling." The pause before fulfilling told me everything I needed to know about what she really thought. Roman was oblivious, completely smitten with this sophisticated woman who seemed to find him fascinating. I watched him transform around her, becoming more conscious of his secondhand clothes, more apologetic about our simple lifestyle. He started making excuses for why she couldn't visit, suggesting they meet at restaurants instead of coming home for dinner. "Mom," he had said one evening after she left, "maybe it's time you thought about moving somewhere. Nicer? You've been in this place for so long. Don't you want something better?" The question broke my heart because I could hear Marlowe's voice in it. After years of teaching him that contentment came from within, my son was suddenly ashamed of the home where we had been happy together. "I like it here," I had said simply. "It has good memories." But I could see in his eyes that my answer wasn't what he had hoped for. They married in 2017, a lavish wedding that Marlowe's parents paid for and planned without much input from me. I was invited, of course, but I felt like a guest at my own son's wedding, carefully seated at a back table with distant relatives I had never met. Marlowe looked like a princess in her $1,000 dress, and Roman looked happy in the way that young men do when they believe they've won the ultimate prize. During the reception, I watched them dance to some popular song I didn't recognize, and I tried to convince myself that this was what I had wanted for him all along. Success, love, a bright future. But late that night, alone in my hotel room, I had called Margaret. "The boy doesn't know about the trust, does he?" she had asked. "No, and I want to keep it that way for now. Marlowe married the son of a nurse, not the heir to a medical fortune. Let's see what kind of woman she really is before we complicate things." Margaret had been quiet for a moment. "Celeste, he's going to find out eventually, when something happens to you, when the trust transfers to him. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, I want to watch and wait." It hadn't taken long to see what kind of woman Marlowe really was. Within months of the wedding, my invitations to family dinners became sporadic. Phone calls with Roman grew shorter and less frequent. When I did see them, Marlowe would make subtle comments about my clothes, my apartment, my simple lifestyle that needed to be tolerated rather than respected. The grandchildren had been my last hope for maintaining a connection to the family I had sacrificed everything to protect. When James was born, I was relegated to brief supervised visits. By the time Fallon came along, Marlowe had perfected the art of making me feel like an unwelcome obligation rather than a beloved grandmother. Now, sitting in my armchair 34 years after Richard's death, watching my grandchildren sleep peacefully on my old couch, I finally admitted to myself what I had been refusing to see. My sacrifice hadn't protected Roman from the corrupting influence of wealth. It had simply made him vulnerable to a different kind of corruption. Marlowe hadn't fallen in love with the man I had raised. She had fallen in love with her idea of what she could make him become. And in trying to transform him into someone worthy of her standards, she was systematically destroying everything I had taught him about real value. But there was one thing Marlowe didn't know, one card I had been holding for 34 years. Tomorrow, when she came to collect the children, she was going to meet the real Celeste Montgomery. Not the poor nurse who lived in a tiny apartment and was grateful for scraps of attention from her son's family. Tomorrow, she was going to meet the woman who owned one of the largest medical groups on the East Coast, who had $47 million sitting in trust funds and investment accounts, who had been quietly building an empire while pretending to live paycheck to paycheck. Tomorrow, the game was going to change completely. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a contact I rarely used. When the voice answered, professional and immediately alert despite the late hour, I spoke the words I had hoped never to say. "This is Celeste Montgomery. I need 4 cars ready by 10 a.m. tomorrow, black Bentleys, and I want them parked exactly where I tell you to park them. The war Marlowe had started with my grandchildren was about to become very, very real. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that comes after a storm. I woke at 5:30, the same time I had been waking for 34 years, but this time was different. This time, I wasn't getting up to prepare for another shift of taking care of other people while neglecting myself. This time, I was preparing for war. Fallon and James were still asleep on the pull-out couch, their small bodies finally relaxed after yesterday's emotional upheaval. Fallon had cried herself to sleep in my arms, torn between the loyalty her mother demanded and the love she naturally felt for me. No child should have to carry that burden. I made coffee in my old percolator, the one Richard had bought me during our first year of marriage. The familiar sound of bubbling water and the rich aroma filling my small kitchen gave me comfort, grounding me in the reality of what I was about to do. I had spent 3 decades hiding who I really was. Today, that masquerade was ending. At exactly 7 o'clock, my phone rang. Margaret's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear the underlying concern. "Celeste, are you absolutely certain about this course of action? Once you reveal your financial position, there's no going back. The family dynamics will change permanently." I looked toward the living room where my grandchildren slept, remembering Fallon's whispered words about being a poor loser, remembering the pain in her eyes as she repeated her mother's poison. "I'm certain, Margaret. 34 years of protecting them from the truth has only allowed them to abuse that protection. It's time they learned who they're really dealing with." "Very well. I'll have the documents ready by 9. The cars will arrive at exactly 10, as you requested. Are you prepared for their reaction?" I smiled, feeling a strength I hadn't accessed in decades flowing through my veins. "I've been preparing for this moment since 1990, Margaret. I'm more than ready." After hanging up, I opened my closet and pushed aside the simple cardigans and sensible shoes I had worn for so many years. In the very back, wrapped in garment bags that hadn't been touched in over a decade, hung the clothes from my previous life. The life when I was Mrs. Richard Montgomery, not just Celeste the nurse. I pulled out a black Chanel suit that still fit perfectly, designer shoes that cost more than most people spent on rent, and a string of pearls that Richard had given me for our 5th anniversary. As I dressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and saw the woman I had buried beneath years of deliberate simplicity. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms and charity galas, who had held her own among New York's elite. The transformation was more than physical. As I pinned my hair into the elegant chignon I used to wear, as I applied makeup with the skill I had learned from the best cosmetologists money could buy, I felt my confidence returning like muscle memory. This was who I really was. This was the woman Marlowe had underestimated so completely. Fallon woke first, rubbing her eyes and looking around my apartment with the confusion that comes from sleeping in an unfamiliar place. When she saw me, her mouth fell open. "Grandma? You look different." I knelt down to her level, smoothing her tangled hair with gentle fingers. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people have to dress up for important meetings. Today is one of those days." James stirred awake and gasped when he saw me. "Wow, Grandma, you look like a movie star." Despite everything, I laughed. "Thank you, baby. Now, let's get you both dressed and fed. Your parents are coming to pick you up soon, and I have something very important to discuss with your mother." As I helped them get ready, my phone buzzed with updates from Margaret. The cars were being detailed and would arrive precisely on schedule. The documents were prepared and loaded into her briefcase. The stage was set for the performance of a lifetime. At 9:45, I positioned myself at the window overlooking the street. The children were clean, fed, and playing quietly with some toys I kept for their visits. I had explained that Mommy and Daddy would be here soon, but I hadn't prepared them for what they were about to witness. At exactly 10 o'clock, 4 black Bentleys turned onto my quiet street in perfect formation. The sight was striking even from 3 floors up, expensive cars that belonged in Manhattan's financial district, not in front of a modest apartment building in Queens. Neighbors began coming out of their buildings, drawn by the unusual spectacle. The first car stopped directly in front of my building. The second pulled up behind it. The third and fourth positioned themselves across the street, creating an unmistakable display of wealth and power. The drivers remained in their vehicles, waiting with the professional patience that only comes with expensive training. Margaret emerged from the lead car, her silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years representing New York's wealthiest families. Behind her, two other women emerged from the second car, my financial advisor and my estate manager, both impeccably dressed and carrying briefcases. The message was clear and unmistakable. Celeste Montgomery was not just a poor nurse living paycheck to paycheck. She was a woman with serious resources and serious representation. "James, Fallon," I said calmly, "come stand with me at the window. Your parents will be here any moment." The children pressed their faces against the glass, James pointing excitedly at the cars. "Grandma, why are there so many fancy cars outside?" "Those are my friends," I said simply. "They're here to help me with some business." 5 minutes later, Roman's modest Honda Accord turned onto the street and stopped abruptly when he saw the display waiting for him. I watched my son's face through the windshield, saw the confusion and growing alarm as he took in the scene. Beside him, Marlowe's perfectly contoured features went through a rapid sequence of emotions: confusion, suspicion, and then something very close to panic. They sat in their car for nearly 2 full minutes, clearly debating what to do. I could imagine the conversation. Marlowe demanding to know what this was about, Roman trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Finally, they got out of the car, Marlowe's designer heels clicking against the pavement with sharp, angry sounds. Margaret approached them with the kind of professional courtesy that masked steel. I couldn't hear the conversation from 3 floors up, but I could read body language well enough. Marlowe's gestures were becoming more animated, more defensive. Roman looked confused and increasingly worried. Margaret remained perfectly calm, undoubtedly explaining that Mrs. Montgomery was waiting upstairs and would be happy to clarify everything. When the knock came at my door, I took a deep breath and smoothed my skirt. The children looked between me and the door with curiosity, sensing something significant was happening but not understanding what. I opened the door to find Roman and Marlowe standing in my hallway, both of them looking like they had been ambushed. Behind them, Margaret waited with professional patience. "Hello, Roman. Marlowe." My voice was calm, controlled. "Please come in. Margaret, you can wait in the hallway for now." Roman stepped inside first, his eyes taking in my appearance with growing bewilderment. "Mom, why are you dressed like that? What's with all the cars?" Marlowe followed, her suspicious gaze sweeping my apartment as if she expected to find evidence of some elaborate deception. When she spoke, her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who felt threatened but didn't yet understand why. "What is this, Celeste? Some kind of performance? Are you trying to impress us by hiring cars you can't afford?" I smiled, feeling the satisfaction of a chess player who had just revealed their strategy. "Please, sit down. Both of you. James, Fallon, why don't you play in the bedroom for a few minutes while Mommy, Daddy, and I have a grown-up conversation?" The children obediently disappeared into my bedroom, though I could see Fallon lingering near the doorway, her curiosity outweighing her obedience. Roman remained standing, his confusion evident. "Mom, seriously, what's going on? Those are very expensive cars outside. People are staring. The neighbors are taking pictures." Marlowe perched on the edge of my old couch, as if she were afraid it might contaminate her designer clothes. "This is ridiculous. Whatever point you're trying to make, just make it so we can collect the children and leave." I walked to my kitchen counter and picked up the manila folder Margaret had delivered that morning. Inside were documents that would change everything: financial statements, trust fund papers, property deeds. 34 years of hidden wealth laid bare in black and white. "You know, Marlowe," I said conversationally, "yesterday my granddaughter told me some very interesting things. She said you told her I was a poor loser who lived in an ugly place because I never had anything good in my life. Marlowe's face flushed, but her chin lifted defensively. Children misinterpret things. If Fallon said something inappropriate, I'm sorry, but... She also said you told her that real families don't live like this. I gestured around my modest apartment. That I'm jealous of you because you're pretty and have nice things while I don't. Roman shot a sharp look at his wife. Marlo, did you actually say those things to Fallon? It's not what you think, Marlo said quickly. I was just trying to help her understand why your mother lives so differently from us. Children need context to... Context. I repeated the word, tasting its bitterness. You're right, Marlo. Children do need context. So let me provide some. I opened the manila folder and pulled out the first document. A financial statement from Goldman Sachs showing liquid assets of $47,300,000. I placed it on the coffee table between us. Roman stared at the paper, his face going pale. What is this? That's my current net worth, I said calmly. Not counting real estate or the medical group holdings. Marlo leaned forward to read the document, her eyes widening as she took in the numbers. This has to be fake. This is some kind of... I placed the second document on the table. Montgomery Medical Group ownership papers, showing Celeste Montgomery as majority shareholder of 7 hospitals and 3 medical research facilities. This is impossible, Roman whispered, sinking into my armchair as if his legs could no longer support him. Mom, where did this come from? Your father, I said gently. He left everything to me when he died. Everything. I've been the primary owner of Montgomery Medical Group for 34 years. Marlo grabbed the papers, studying them with growing desperation. But you work as a nurse. You live in this tiny apartment. You dress like someone who chose to live modestly while teaching my son that wealth doesn't define character. I pulled out the third document, trust fund papers showing $15 million set aside for each of my grandchildren. I wanted Roman to understand the value of hard work, the importance of being grateful for what you have instead of always wanting more. The silence in the room was deafening. Roman stared at me like he was seeing a stranger. Marlo's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that all color had drained from her face. You've been lying to us for 34 years, Roman said finally, his voice hollow. Not lying, I corrected. Protecting. There's a difference. Marlo stood up abruptly, pacing toward my window where the Bentleys waited like silent sentinels. This is insane. You let us think you were struggling financially. You let us feel sorry for you. Did you feel sorry for me? I asked pointedly. Because from where I was sitting, it seemed like you felt embarrassed by me. Ashamed to have a mother-in-law who wasn't part of your social circle. That's not true, Roman protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I walked to my small bookshelf and pulled out a photo album I had kept hidden for years. Inside were pictures from my previous life, charity galas, hospital board meetings, society events where I had stood beside New York's most influential families. This is who I used to be, I said, showing them a photograph of me at a Metropolitan Opera gala, wearing a gown that cost more than most cars. This is the world I gave up to make sure you understood that character matters more than status. Marlo stared at the photo, then at me, then back at the photo. Why are you showing us this now? I closed the album and met her eyes directly. Because yesterday, you used my grandchildren as weapons against me. You poisoned their minds with lies about my worth, my value to this family. You made a 7-year-old child choose between loving her grandmother and pleasing her mother. I never said she had to choose. You told her I was jealous of you. You told her real families don't live like me. You made her ashamed to love me. My voice remained calm, but steel ran underneath every word. That ends now. Roman stood up, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was overwhelmed. I don't understand any of this. Why hide it? Why pretend to struggle when you could have lived like… Like what? Like your wife? Spending money on designer clothes and expensive cars while teaching our children that love can be bought and sold? I shook my head. I chose to live simply because I wanted you to become a good man, not just a rich one. Marlo was still staring at the financial documents, her mind clearly racing through the implications. When she looked up, I saw something new in her eyes. Not just shock, but calculation. The student loans, she said suddenly. Roman's medical school loans. They were paid off by an anonymous benefactor. I smiled. Not so anonymous. You've been supporting us financially without telling us, Roman said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. The things that seemed like coincidences, the opportunities that came out of nowhere. I made sure you had what you needed while believing you were earning it yourself. I picked up the documents from the coffee table, straightening them with deliberate care. I wanted you to have pride in your accomplishments. And now? Marlo asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked toward my bedroom, where I could hear Fallon and James playing quietly, their innocent laughter a sharp contrast to the heavy tension in the living room. Now, I said, we're going to discuss new arrangements. Because I will not allow my grandchildren to be turned against me by someone who has spent years underestimating exactly who she was dealing with. The war was no longer hidden. The pieces were on the board, and everyone could see exactly what kind of game we were really playing. The silence that followed my revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Roman stood frozen beside my armchair, staring at the financial documents as if they might disappear if he blinked. Marlo had moved to the window, her back rigid as she watched the 4 Bentleys lined up like an army waiting for orders. From my bedroom came the sound of Fallon singing softly to herself, the same lullaby I used to sing to Roman when he was small. The innocence of that sound in the midst of this confrontation made my chest tighten with protective fury. I need to understand something, Roman said finally, his voice strained. You've been watching me struggle through residency, watching me worry about money, about providing for my family, and all this time you could have… Could have what? I interrupted gently. Robbed you of the satisfaction of earning your success? Could have turned you into someone who expected wealth instead of working for it? Marlo spun around from the window, her composure finally cracking. You let me think you were a burden. You let me believe you needed our charity, our tolerance. Do you have any idea how that makes me look now? How it makes you look. I raised an eyebrow. Marlo, this isn't about your image. This is about the fact that you've spent years poisoning my grandchildren against me because you thought I was beneath your standards. That's not true, she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I walked to my purse and pulled out a small recording device, one of those modern gadgets Margaret had suggested I start using to document conversations. Would you like to hear what Fallon told me yesterday? Word for word? Marlo's face went white. Roman looked between us with growing alarm. You recorded our daughter? Marlo's voice was shrill now, the careful control she always maintained finally slipping. I recorded my granddaughter repeating the lies you taught her about me. I pressed play, and Fallon's innocent 7-year-old voice filled the room. Mommy said you're a poor loser, and we have to stay with you because Daddy feels sorry for you. She said you never had anything good in your life, and that's why you live in this ugly place. She said real families don't live like this. The recording continued, each cruel word delivered in my granddaughter's sweet voice, each phrase obviously rehearsed and repeated from conversations she shouldn't have been part of. Roman sank back into the armchair as if the weight of what he was hearing had physically pushed him down. Marlo, please tell me you didn't actually say these things to our children. I was trying to help them understand. Understand what? Roman's voice was rising now, anger replacing confusion. That their grandmother is somehow less worthy of their love because she doesn't live in a mansion? Marlo looked trapped, her usual confidence abandoning her. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. My friends, my family. They judge me for having a mother-in-law who… Who what? I asked quietly. Who worked night shifts to put her son through medical school? Who sacrificed everything to teach him values? Who chose substance over surface? Who embarrasses me? Marlo said suddenly, the truth finally spilling out. There, I said it. You embarrass me, Celeste. When my friends meet you, when they see where you live, how you dress, they wonder what kind of family Roman comes from. They wonder what that says about me. The honesty was brutal, but at least it was honest. Roman stared at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time. So, you decided to solve your embarrassment by turning our children against their grandmother, he said slowly. I was protecting them from confusion. They couldn't understand why their grandmother lived so differently from everyone else they knew. I was giving them a framework to understand. You were teaching them to be ashamed of love that doesn't come with a price tag, I said firmly. You were teaching them that a person's worth is measured by their possessions. I walked to my bedroom door and called softly, Fallon, James, could you come here for a moment? The children emerged, Fallon immediately sensing the tension in the room. She moved closer to me instinctively, while James looked between his parents with the confusion of a 6-year-old who knew something was wrong, but couldn't identify what. Fallon, I said gently, kneeling to her level. Yesterday you told me some things that hurt my feelings. Do you remember what you said? She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I'm sorry, Grandma. Mommy said if I was nice to you, it would hurt her feelings because you were trying to steal me and James away from her. Roman's head snapped toward Marlo. You told our daughter that? It wasn't like that, Marlo protested weakly. I took Fallon's small hands in mine. Sweetheart, I want you to understand something very important. Your mommy and I both love you very much. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes when they're worried about things that aren't really important. Your mommy was worried that I didn't have fancy things like she does, and she thought that made me less special. But you do have fancy things, James piped up, pointing toward the window. Those cars outside are really fancy. I smiled at him. You're right, they are. But do you know what makes those cars special? It's not that they're expensive. It's that they're taking me to see the hospitals where your grandfather used to help sick people get better. That's what makes them important. Fallon looked confused. Grandpa had hospitals? Your grandfather built hospitals to help people, I explained. And when he died, he asked me to take care of them. But I wanted to make sure your daddy grew up understanding that helping people matters more than having fancy things. Roman was watching this exchange with something close to awe. Mom, you've been running Montgomery Medical Group this whole time? Not running, exactly. I have very good people who handle the day-to-day operations. But yes, I've been the owner for 34 years. I stood up, still holding Fallon's hand. Every year, the hospitals help thousands of people get better. That's what your grandfather would have wanted. Why didn't you tell us? Roman asked, genuine pain in his voice. Because I wanted you to become a doctor because you cared about helping people, not because you wanted to inherit a medical empire. I looked at Marlo, who was still standing by the window, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. And I wanted to see what kind of person you would marry. Whether you would choose someone who valued character or someone who valued status. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Marlo understood perfectly what I was saying. So, this is all some kind of test? She asked, her voice tight with anger. You've been judging me for years while pretending to be someone you're not? I haven't been pretending to be anyone, I replied calmly. I've been choosing to live simply while you've been choosing to judge me for it. There's a difference. Margaret appeared in my doorway, having waited patiently in the hallway during this family confrontation. Mrs. Montgomery, if I may interrupt, we have the additional documents you requested. She handed me another folder, this one containing papers I had hoped never to use. Trust fund documents with very specific conditions, legal guardianship papers, and custody arrangements that I had put in place years ago as insurance against exactly this situation. What are those? Roman asked, eyeing the new papers with growing concern. Protections, I said simply. Legal protections for my grandchildren's welfare and their relationships with their family members. Marlo stepped away from the window, alarm replacing her earlier shock. What kind of protections? I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. A trust fund has been established for each child, as I mentioned. $15 million each to be accessed when they turn 25. However, there are conditions. What conditions? Roman asked, though he sounded like he already dreaded the answer. The children must maintain a relationship with all their family members, including their paternal grandmother. Any attempt to alienate them from family members through manipulation or coercion will result in the immediate suspension of trust fund access. Marlo's mouth fell open. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Furthermore, any parent found to be engaging in parental alienation, which includes teaching children to disrespect or fear family members without justifiable cause, will forfeit their own access to any Montgomery family resources. What Montgomery family resources? Roman asked, confusion replacing anger. I pulled out another document. Your student loans weren't paid by an anonymous benefactor, Roman. They were paid by Montgomery Medical Group as an employee benefit. Your residency program? It's partially funded by Montgomery Medical Group grants. The down payment for your house? That came from a Montgomery Family Foundation loan with very favorable terms. The color drained from Roman's face as the full scope of my involvement in his life became clear. Everything? My entire career has been supported by the medical group your father built, which I've been expanding and improving for 34 years. But Roman, you earned your position. You earned your medical degree through your own intelligence and hard work. I simply made sure you had the opportunities to succeed. Marlo was frantically reading through the documents, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. This says that continued support is conditional on family harmony and respect for all family members. That's correct. You're blackmailing us, she said accusingly. I'm protecting my grandchildren from being used as weapons in a war they don't understand. I walked to where Fallon and James were standing, still holding hands and watching the adults with wide, worried eyes. I'm ensuring that they grow up knowing they're loved by their entire family, not just the parts that someone else approves of. Roman stood up slowly, running his hands through his hair again. Mom, this is overwhelming. I don't know how to process all of this. You don't have to process it all at once, I said gently. What you need to understand is that nothing has changed except your awareness of the situation. I'm still the same person who raised you, who loves you, who wants the best for your children. The only difference is that now you know I have the resources to ensure their well-being and their right to love their grandmother without fear of retribution. Marlo was still reading the legal documents, her face growing paler with each page. These papers give you legal standing to sue for grandparents' rights if we interfere with your relationship with the children. I hope it never comes to that, I said honestly. But yes, if necessary, I will use every legal resource at my disposal to protect my grandchildren from emotional manipulation. The room fell silent again, everyone processing the magnitude of what had been revealed. Outside, the 4 Bentleys waited patiently, their presence a constant reminder that this was no longer a family dispute between equals. Finally, Fallon tugged on my hand. Grandma, does this mean you're not a poor loser? I smiled down at her, my heart breaking a little at the innocence of the question. No, sweetheart. I'm not poor, and I'm definitely not a loser. But more importantly, being poor doesn't make someone a loser, and having money doesn't make someone better than anyone else. What makes someone special is how they treat the people they love. She nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 7-year-old logic. So Mommy was wrong when she said those things about you? I looked at Marlo, who was staring at her daughter with something that might have been shame. Mommy was scared and confused, sweetheart. Sometimes adults say things they don't mean when they're feeling scared. But Marlo wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at the custody papers, the trust fund documents, the evidence of a power she had never suspected existed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want from us?" I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the folder. "I want my grandchildren to know they can love their grandmother without betraying their mother. I want family dinners where I'm welcomed, not tolerated. I want phone calls that aren't obligations. I want to be part of their lives without having to apologize for existing." "And if we agree to this?" Roman asked. "Then nothing changes except that the children get to know their full family history, including the legacy their grandfather left them. They get to understand that they come from people who built something meaningful, who helped others, who believed in using their resources to make the world better." I looked directly at Marlo. "And you get to learn that sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones who choose not to show their power until they have to." The war was over before it had really begun. Not because anyone had surrendered, but because the balance of power had shifted so completely that resistance was pointless. Marlo finally understood that she hadn't been tolerating a poor, embarrassing mother-in-law. She had been underestimating one of the most powerful women in New York medical circles. And that realization was going to change everything. The days following our confrontation unfolded like dominoes falling in slow motion. Marlo had left my apartment that morning in stunned silence, clutching the copies of legal documents that outlined her new reality. Roman had stayed behind for 20 minutes, asking questions I could see he was afraid to hear the answers to. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" he had asked, standing in my doorway with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking younger than his 39 years. "When you turned 40, I had answered honestly. I wanted you to establish yourself first, to know your own worth before you knew your inheritance." He had nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom even as it hurt. "And if something happened to you before then?" "Margaret has instructions. Everything would have transferred to you immediately, along with a letter explaining everything." I had touched his cheek the way I used to when he was small. "I never intended to take the truth to my grave, Roman. I just wanted to choose the right time." But Marlo had taken that choice away from both of us. 3 days later, I was in my kitchen making tea when my phone rang. It was Roman, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "Mom, I need to tell you something. About Marlo. About what she's been doing." I set down my teacup, suddenly alert. "What do you mean?" "I went through her things. Her computer, her phone records. After what happened at your apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about the recordings you played, about the things she said to Fallon." He paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. "It's worse than we thought." "How much worse?" "She's been documenting everything about you for months. Your routines, your apartment, your finances, or what she thought your finances were. She had a whole file on her laptop labeled Celeste Investigation." My blood went cold. "What kind of documentation?" "Photos of your building, your mailbox, your car. She hired a private investigator 6 months ago to look into your background. She was trying to find proof that you were hiding assets or lying about your income." The irony was staggering. Marlo had been looking for evidence of deception and had completely missed the $47 million elephant in the room. "There's more," Roman continued, his voice getting tighter. "I found email chains between her and her mother, her sister. They've been planning ways to limit your access to the kids. They were talking about having you declared mentally incompetent." I gripped the phone harder. "On what grounds?" "Your age, your financial irresponsibility, your inappropriate attachment to the children. They were building a case to prove you weren't fit to be around Fallon and James unsupervised." The betrayal cut deeper than I had expected, not just from Marlo, but from people who had never even met me, who had been willing to destroy an elderly woman's relationship with her grandchildren based on lies and prejudice. "Roman, there's something you need to understand. The private investigator she hired?" His name is David Chen, and he works for a firm that specializes in asset recovery and fraud investigation. How do you know that? Because Margaret has been monitoring any inquiries into my background for years. It's standard protocol for someone with my level of assets. We know exactly what Mr. Chen found, and more importantly, what he reported back to your wife. Silence stretched between us. Finally, Roman spoke, his voice hollow. What did he find? Nothing. Because I've never hidden my assets illegally, and my financial arrangements are completely transparent to anyone with the proper legal access. I paused, letting this sink in. But the fact that she hired him tells us exactly what her intentions were. She was looking for ammunition to use against you. Worse than that, she was looking for evidence of fraud so she could have me investigated by the authorities. She wanted me arrested, Roman. The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told me he hadn't considered this possibility. The emails to her family weren't just gossip, I continued. They were building a legal strategy to remove me from your lives permanently. If she had found what she was looking for, I would have been facing criminal charges. But she didn't find anything. No, but she didn't stop looking. According to Margaret's sources, she contacted 3 different law firms in the past 2 months, asking about elder abuse cases and financial exploitation. She was shopping for lawyers who would help her build a case against me. I heard Roman sink into a chair, the sound of defeat clear even through the phone. I married a monster. You married someone who felt threatened by something she didn't understand. Unfortunately, instead of trying to understand it, she decided to destroy it. What happens now? That was the question I had been dreading, because the answer was going to hurt him almost as much as the truth about Marlo had. Now we implement the protections I put in place. The trust fund conditions aren't just about parental alienation, Roman. They include clauses about any attempts to legally harass or intimidate family members. Marlo's investigation and her attempts to build a fraud case constitute legal harassment. Meaning she's already violated the terms of the children's trust funds. The $15 million set aside for each of them is no longer accessible to her as their guardian. It will be held in trust until they're 25, and she'll have no say in how it's managed. Roman was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder. There's something else I found in her emails to her sister. I waited. She's been planning to divorce me. Has been for months. She was waiting until she could prove you were a financial liability so she could argue for full custody. She wanted to make sure the kids never saw you again, and she wanted to use that as leverage for a bigger settlement. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Marlo hadn't just been trying to eliminate me from their lives out of embarrassment or social anxiety. She had been systematically working to destroy my relationship with my grandchildren as part of a calculated plan to maximize her divorce settlement. She never loved me, Roman continued, his voice breaking slightly. The whole marriage was a business transaction. She married the son of a nurse because she thought it would make her look charitable, and she was planning to trade up once she had secured her social position and had children to use as bargaining chips. Roman, no, Mom. I need to say this. I've been an idiot. I let her convince me that you were the problem, that your simple lifestyle was somehow a reflection on me. I let her poison my children against their grandmother because I was too proud to see what was really happening. The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. This was my son, the little boy I had raised to be kind and honest. Discovering that the woman he had pledged his life to had been playing a long game of deception and manipulation. What are you going to do? I asked gently. I'm going to file for divorce, and I'm going to ask for full custody of the children. Roman, that's a very serious step. Are you sure? I'm sure. I found her research on parental alienation tactics, Mom. She wasn't just accidentally turning the kids against you. She was following a playbook. She has articles printed out about how to systematically destroy a child's relationship with a grandparent. She studied this like it was a college course. My heart broke for my grandchildren. they hadn't just been caught in the crossfire of adult conflicts. They had been deliberately targeted in a campaign of emotional manipulation designed to serve their mother's financial interests. "I have copies of everything," Roman continued. "The emails, the investigation reports, the legal consultations. Margaret will want to see all of it." "Yes, she will. But Roman, I want you to think carefully about what comes next. Once you start divorce proceedings against someone like Marlo, someone who has been planning and calculating for this long, it's going to get very ugly very quickly. Let it get ugly. She used my children as weapons against their grandmother. She was willing to have you arrested on false charges to get what she wanted. I don't care how ugly it gets." That afternoon, Roman came to my apartment with a banker's box full of printed emails, documents, and financial records. Margaret arrived an hour later, and the three of us spent the evening going through evidence of a conspiracy that was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. "This is actually quite helpful," Margaret said, reading through Marlo's communications with her family. "She's documented her own premeditation. Any judge who sees this will understand exactly what kind of person we're dealing with." "What about the children?" I asked. "How do we protect them from being hurt by all of this?" "We document everything. We show the court that Marlo has been engaging in systematic parental alienation, that she hired investigators to build false cases against family members, and that she was planning to use the children as leverage in a divorce she's been orchestrating for months." Roman looked up from a stack of emails. "Will they have to testify? Will they have to choose sides?" "Not if we do this right," Margaret assured him. "The evidence speaks for itself. We have her own words, her own plans, her own documentation of deliberate manipulation. No child should have to testify against their mother, but in this case, the mother has provided all the evidence we need." As the evening wore on, the full extent of Marlo's deception became clear. She had been living a completely different life than the one Roman thought they shared. While he believed they were building a family together, she had been systematically planning his destruction and mine. But she had made one crucial error. She had underestimated exactly who she was trying to destroy. The woman she thought was a powerless nurse was actually someone with resources she couldn't have imagined, legal protection she couldn't have anticipated, and documentation of her own crimes that she never knew was being collected. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as she packed up the documents. "The private investigator she hired? He's been reporting her activities to us for 3 months. Professional courtesy between investigators. When someone starts digging into a client of ours, we like to know what they're looking for." Roman stared at her. "You've been watching her watch us?" "Standard protection protocol. We knew she was building a case. We knew what kind of case, and we knew it would fail. But we documented everything she did, every law firm she contacted, every false allegation she tried to substantiate. So she never had a chance. She never had a chance the moment she decided to use children as weapons against their family," I said firmly. "Some lines should never be crossed." That night, after Roman and Margaret left, I sat in my kitchen looking at the photos Marlo had taken of my building, my car, my simple life that had driven her to such extremes of hatred and calculation. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt powerful, not because of my money or my legal team or my hidden empire. I felt powerful because I had finally stopped hiding who I was to protect people who didn't deserve protection. Marlo had spent months documenting evidence to use against me. She never suspected that every move she made was being documented to use against her. The student had become the teacher, and the lesson was about to be very expensive. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, not the mansion I could have bought, but a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood with a yard big enough for swing sets and birthday parties. The morning sun streamed through windows that looked out over a garden where Fallon and James were playing with their new puppy, a golden retriever they had named Grandpa in honor of the man they were finally learning about. The divorce had been swift and decisive. Faced with evidence of her own documented conspiracy, Marlowe had accepted a settlement that gave Roman primary custody with supervised visitation for her. She had moved back to her parents' house in Connecticut, her designer lifestyle funded now by alimony rather than the Montgomery fortune she had tried so desperately to claim. "Grandma Celeste, can you come outside?" Fallon called through the screen door. "Grandpa the dog wants to meet the new flowers you planted." I smiled, wiping my hands on a dish towel. At 8 years old now, Fallon had blossomed into the confident, loving child she was meant to be once the poison of manipulation had been removed from her system. It had taken months of family therapy and patient conversations, but she understood now that loving multiple people didn't diminish her love for any one of them. James, now 7, had adapted with the resilience that children possess when the adults in their lives stop confusing them with conflicting loyalties. He spent his weekends helping me in the garden, asking endless questions about his grandfather and the hospitals that still bore the Montgomery name. Roman appeared in my doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and looking more relaxed than I had seen him in years. "The kids want to know if we can visit the main hospital this afternoon. James has been asking about the children's wing again." "Of course," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Margaret called this morning. The new pediatric research facility is ready for the dedication ceremony next month. I thought the children might like to see their grandfather's name on the building." We had decided together that it was time for Fallon and James to understand their full heritage. Not the money, they were still too young for that burden, but the legacy of service, the family tradition of using resources to help others. They knew that their great-grandfather had built hospitals to help sick children, and that their grandmother continued that work. "Any word from Marlowe this week?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from Roman's expression. "She canceled her visitation again, 3rd time this month." He shook his head, but there was more sadness than anger in his voice now. "Her lawyer says she's struggling to adjust to the new family dynamic." What that really meant was that Marlowe couldn't handle being in a room with children who no longer saw her as the ultimate authority, who had learned to think for themselves about the relationships in their lives. The supervised visits had been uncomfortable for everyone, with Marlowe trying to reassert control that no longer existed, and the children politely but firmly maintaining the boundaries they had learned to set. "She'll come around," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. Being a mother is the most important thing she has left. Eventually, she'll realize that being part of their lives is more valuable than controlling their lives. Roman looked out the window at his children, who were now teaching the puppy to sit. "Do you think I'm naive for still hoping she can change?" "I think you're a good father for wanting your children to have a relationship with their mother, even after everything she did. That speaks well of your character, not your naivety." It was true. Despite the evidence of Marlowe's manipulation, despite the months of legal battles and emotional chaos, Roman had never tried to turn the children against their mother. He had explained, in age-appropriate terms, that sometimes adults make mistakes when they're scared or confused, and that families sometimes need time to learn better ways to love each other. The front door opened, and Margaret walked in carrying her familiar briefcase and wearing an expression that I had learned meant good news. "The Patterson Medical Group acquisition is complete," she announced, settling into a chair at my kitchen table. "Montgomery Medical Group now owns 12 hospitals across 3 states, and we're officially the largest private medical group in the Northeast." "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. And every expansion meant more resources for research, more beds for patients, more jobs for people who shared our commitment to healing. "There's something else," Margaret continued, opening her briefcase. "The board meeting yesterday approved the new family foundation structure. Roman, when you're ready to take over operational control, everything will be in place for a seamless transition." Roman looked up from his coffee, still not entirely comfortable with discussions of his future inheritance. "I still think 40 is too young to take over something that significant." "Your father was 38 when he inherited from his father," I reminded him. "And you've had the advantage of medical training and actual experience in hospitals. You understand the mission in a way that goes beyond business." It was true. Roman's years as a resident and now as an attending physician had given him insights into healthcare that most medical group owners never developed. He understood patient care from the ground up, knew what doctors and nurses needed to do their jobs effectively, could speak with authority about the kind of facilities that actually served their communities. "The children's trust funds have been restructured as well," Margaret added, addressing me. "Per your instructions, they're now tied to the foundation. When they reach 25, they'll inherit not just money, but stewardship responsibilities." This had been my idea, inspired by watching Fallon and James develop their own sense of empathy and justice. Rather than simply giving them wealth, I wanted to give them purpose. Their trust funds would provide financial security, but accessing them would require active participation in the Family Foundation's mission of healthcare and community service. "What kind of responsibilities?" Roman asked. "They'll serve on the foundation board, help determine funding priorities, and participate in direct service projects. The money comes with the expectation that they'll use it to continue what their great-grandfather started." Roman smiled, understanding the wisdom in this approach. "So they'll inherit the obligation to help others, not just the means to help themselves." "Exactly. Though they'll have complete freedom to choose how they fulfill that obligation. They might become doctors like you, or researchers, or administrators, or advocates. The important thing is that they understand wealth as a tool for service, not an end in itself." Through the window, we watched Fallon patiently teaching James how to brush the puppy's fur while explaining something to him in the serious way that 8-year-olds explain important things to 7-year-olds. They were good children, kind children, and I felt confident that they would grow into adults who understood the difference between having resources and being entitled to them. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, pulling out a final document. "The custody modification you requested has been approved. You're now listed as a legal guardian with full rights in case of emergency. Roman's decision, but it makes it official." This meant more to me than any financial milestone ever could. After all the years of being gradually pushed to the margins of my family's life, I was now legally recognized as an essential part of my grandchildren's support system. If anything happened to Roman, I wouldn't have to fight for access to Fallon and James. I would simply step into my role as their primary caregiver. "Thank you," I said to Roman, meaning it more deeply than those simple words could convey. "Thank you," he replied, "for never giving up on us, even when we gave up on you. For protecting us in ways we didn't even know we needed protection. For teaching me that real strength sometimes looks like weakness to people who don't know what they're looking at." Later that afternoon, we drove to Montgomery Presbyterian Hospital, the flagship facility of our medical group. As we walked through the lobby, I watched Fallon and James take in the bustling activity. Doctors consulting with patients, families reuniting with loved ones, the constant movement of people dedicated to healing. "This is where Daddy works sometimes," I explained as we rode the elevator to the administrative floor. "And this is where your great-grandfather used to work every day." "Did he wear a white coat like Daddy?" James asked. "Sometimes. But more often he wore regular clothes because he spent a lot of time talking to people about how to make the hospital better for patients." We arrived at the boardroom where a portrait of Richard hung alongside the other founding members of what had become Montgomery Medical Group. The children stood before his picture, studying the face of the grandfather they had never met, but whose legacy they were inheriting. "He looks like Daddy," Fallon observed. "He does, and he would have loved you both very much. He believed that families should take care of each other and use their blessings to take care of other people too." As we drove home, the children chattering in the back seat about everything they had seen, I felt the deep satisfaction of a plan that had finally come to fruition. Not the plan to hide my wealth, that had been about protection. The real plan, the one I had been working toward for 34 years, was to raise a family that understood that love and responsibility were inseparable. Roman had learned that lesson through hardship, through discovering that the people who claim to love you might have ulterior motives. The children were learning it through abundance, through understanding that having much means owing much to the world around you. That evening, after dinner and homework and the elaborate bedtime ritual that involved reading 3 stories and checking for monsters under the bed, I sat in my living room with Roman while the children slept peacefully upstairs. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "All those years of living simply when you could have lived." "Well, like this?" He gestured around the comfortable but modest home I had chosen. I considered the question seriously. "No. I regret that it took a crisis to bring us back together. I regret that the children had to be hurt in the process. But I don't regret the years I spent teaching you that character matters more than status. Even if it meant you were lonely? Even if it meant being disrespected and excluded?" "Roman, I was never lonely when I was with you. And being disrespected by people who didn't know my worth only proved that I was right to value different things than they did." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of a house full of family, the soft whisper of the dishwasher, the distant hum of a nightlight in the children's room, the settling sounds of a home that was truly lived in. "I have something to tell you," Roman said finally, "about Marlo." I waited. "She's getting remarried, to someone she met through her parents, someone who thinks she was the victim in our divorce." I felt a pang of something, not quite sadness, not quite pity, but a complex emotion that encompassed the waste of potential, the tragedy of someone who had chosen manipulation over authenticity so completely that she couldn't find her way back to genuine connection. "I hope she's happy," I said, and meant it. "I hope she learns to love someone without trying to control them." "Will you tell the children?" "We'll tell them together when you're ready. They should know that their mother is starting a new chapter in her life. It might even be good for them to see that people can choose different paths and still find contentment." Roman nodded, though I could see he was still processing his own feelings about his ex-wife's future. "There's something else," he said. "Something I've been wanting to say for months." "What's that?" "I'm proud to be your son, not because of the money or the hospitals or any of that. I'm proud because you taught me that doing the right thing is more important than looking like you're doing the right thing. You taught me that love means protecting people from harm, even when they don't understand that they're in danger." I felt tears prick my eyes. "You've always been my greatest accomplishment, Roman, not the business I inherited or the wealth I preserved. You, the man you became, the father you are, the integrity you've maintained even when it would have been easier to compromise." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to use our resources wisely, new chances to demonstrate that wealth without wisdom is merely accumulation, but wealth with purpose is transformation. But tonight, I was simply a grandmother whose family was whole again, whose legacy was secure not in bank accounts or legal documents, but in the character of the people I loved most. The war was over. Love had won. Not through conquest, but through patience. Not through force, but through the quiet strength of never giving up on the people who matter most. And in the end, that was the only victory that had ever mattered. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.